Something extraordinary just happened on national television. Picture this. A sitting governor, the leader of an entire state, is confronted on live TV about fraud so massive it eclipses the entire Department of Corrections budget. Instead of explaining it, instead of owning it, he spirals. His answers wobble, his tone cracks, and suddenly the interview turns into something no one expected. And then, almost unbelievably, he tries to blame everyone else, the media, the critics, even the people asking the questions. At one point, he even suggests that pointing out fraud is demonizing communities, dodging the basic question of accountability. Today, we're diving into exactly why Tim Walz is in the biggest political meltdown of his career, why MSNBC of all networks pressed him so hard, and why this scandal is getting national traction. From state employees to federal investigators to even people inside his own political circles. By the end of this video, you'll understand why his reaction was so chaotic, why it matters to everyday Americans, and how it connects to a larger conversation about leadership, responsibility, and integrity. Let's walk through it step by step. And trust me, this story only gets stranger the deeper we go. So here's what happened. Governor Tim Walz sat down for what should have been a routine interview with Kristen Welker on Meet the Press broadcast on MSNBC. The topic, fraud in Minnesota's social services system during the C-09 pandemic. Not a minor issue. We're talking about somewhere between several hundred million and well over $1 billion in taxpayer money stolen through government programs. To put that in perspective, that's more money than Minnesota spends each year running its entire prison system. Now, imagine you're watching this interview. You're a citizen who's paid taxes your whole life. You've trusted that those dollars go toward roads, schools, healthcare, safety nets for people who genuinely need help. And then you hear that people exploited the system on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. Naturally, you'd want to know who let this happen, what's being done about it, and most importantly, does the person in charge take any responsibility? That's exactly what the interviewer asked. She looked Governor Walz in the eye and said, "Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state?" And that's when things started to unravel. Walz's first response was telling. He said, "Certainly, I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't get to just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems." On the surface, that might sound confident, but listen closely. He's taking credit for prosecuting criminals after the fact, not for preventing the crime in the first place. It's like a security guard saying, "I take responsibility for calling the police after the bank was robbed," while completely ignoring the question of why the vault was left wide open. Then came the part that really raised eyebrows. Walz went on to say, "Minnesota is a generous state. Minnesota is a prosperous state, a well-run state. We're OAA bond rated, but that attracts criminals. Those people are going to jail. We're doing everything we can." Now, let's pause here for a moment. What he's essentially saying is this. Minnesota is so wonderful, so successful that criminals are naturally drawn to it. It's almost as if he's suggesting the fraud happened because the state is doing so well. But here's the problem with that logic. If your leadership and systems were truly strong, wouldn't they also include safeguards to prevent that kind of exploitation? Think of it this way. If you left your front door unlocked every night in a safe neighborhood, and then someone robbed your house, would you say, "Oh, well, my neighborhood is just so nice it attracts burglars"? Or would you admit, I should have locked the door. Most of us would recognize that being in a nice area doesn't excuse poor security. That's the disconnect viewers immediately felt. Walz was trying to spin a failure as a side effect of success. And for many people watching, especially seniors who've spent decades managing households, businesses, and community responsibilities, that kind of deflection didn't sit right. Leadership means acknowledging when something went wrong under your watch, not just taking credit when things go right. But here's where the interview took an even more uncomfortable turn. Walz pivoted to talking about the Somali community in Minnesota, describing them as folks who are in the professions, educators, artists, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs who bring diversity and energy to a place like Minnesota. Then, he said, to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few is lazy. Now, let's be very clear about something. No reasonable person wants to demonize an entire community. But here's the issue. The question wasn't about demonizing anyone. The question was about accountability. When someone shifts the conversation from "what did you do" to stop this to "you are being unfair to an entire group," that's a classic rhetorical move called deflection. It changes the subject without actually answering the original concern. And for a lot of people watching this felt like a red flag because the fraud didn't happen in a vacuum. According to reports, prosecutors say members of the East African diaspora, a community with growing political influence in Minnesota, were largely responsible for these schemes. That's not bias. That's what the legal cases show. And pretending otherwise or framing scrutiny as prejudice doesn't help anyone. Not the victims of the fraud, not the taxpayers, and certainly not the honest members of that community who had nothing to do with it. But the real bombshell came later when the public learned that this wasn't a surprise. In fact, people inside the system had been sounding the alarm for quite some time. Enter the whistleblowers, and this is where the story gets truly troubling. A group identifying themselves as current staff members of the Minnesota Department of Human Services created an online account specifically to share what they had witnessed. Their message was simple but damning. The message was, "We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on. We hoped for a partnership in stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response." According to their statements, when they reported the fraud, instead of being thanked or supported, they faced retaliation. They described monitoring, threats, repression, and deliberate attempts to discredit their reports. In their words, instead of partnership, we got the full weight of retaliation by Tim Walz, certain DFL members, and an indifferent mainstream media. It's scary, isolating, and left us wondering who we can turn to. Now, let's think about what that means. These are people whose job it is to protect taxpayer dollars and ensure that programs actually help the people they are designed to serve. They saw something wrong, they reported it up the chain, and instead of action, they got pushed back. Imagine working in an office where you notice someone stealing from the cash register, you tell your manager, and instead of investigating, the manager makes your life difficult. That's not just frustrating, it's a betrayal of trust. And it gets worse. These whistleblowers also pointed out that Governor Walz disempowered the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which is supposed to provide independent oversight of state agencies. By allowing agencies to ignore or downplay audit findings, the administration effectively removed one of the key checks and balances designed to catch problems early. It's like disabling the smoke detectors in a building and then acting surprised when a fire breaks out. This kind of thing hits especially hard. Many of you remember a time when government accountability was taken seriously, when inspectors general and auditors were respected, even feared because they had the power to shine a light on waste and corruption. To hear that those safeguards were deliberately weakened, that's not just bad policy, it's a fundamental breakdown in how government is supposed to work. So, what was the scale of the fraud? Let's talk numbers because they're staggering. One program designed to feed hungry children during CO became a target for organized theft. Estimates suggest somewhere between $200 and $300 million were stolen. Think about that. Money meant to feed kids, some of the most vulnerable people in our society, was siphoned off into private pockets. And according to one defense attorney representing a convicted fraudster, it was like taking candy from a baby. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of the system's defenses. Then there was a program related to autism services. Fraud in that program ballooned to somewhere in the range of $300 to $400 million. Again, these are services meant for families dealing with serious challenges, people who genuinely need support, and instead, the system was gamed on a massive scale. And then there's the housing program. It was originally budgeted at around $2 to $3 million when it started in the early days of the pandemic. By the time federal investigators took a closer look, costs had exploded to somewhere near $100 million. That's not a budget overrun. That's a system being systematically looted. Add it all up, and you're looking at fraud totaling well over $500 million, possibly approaching or exceeding $1 billion, depending on which estimates you trust. To put that in perspective, for Minnesota taxpayers, that's more than the state spends annually on its entire correctional system. It's an almost unimaginable sum, and here's the kicker. According to multiple reports, much of that money didn't even stay in the United States. Significant portions were allegedly wired overseas, in some cases to countries with weak governments and limited law enforcement. The implication, and federal authorities have raised this concern, is that some of those funds may have ended up supporting networks with ties to extremism. Now, that's still under investigation, and we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. But the possibility alone should make every taxpayer's blood run cold, because here's the thing. When you pay your taxes, you're entering into a kind of social contract. You give the government a portion of your hard-earned money, and in return, you expect that money to be used wisely and honestly. Roads, schools, police, fire departments, programs to help people in genuine need. That's what your taxes are supposed to fund. When that contract is broken, when your money is stolen and possibly used to harm the very country you're trying to support, that's not just fraud, it's a betrayal. So why did MSNBC of all networks press Wall so hard on this? That's a question a lot of people are asking, because historically, that network has been pretty friendly to Democratic politicians. They're not known for the kind of tough prosecutorial questioning you might expect from, say, a more conservative outlet. So what changed? The answer is pretty simple. The fraud became too big to ignore. When you're talking about close to $1 billion or more, when federal prosecutors are handing down dozens of convictions, when the New York Times, not exactly a right-wing publication, publishes a detailed investigation laying out the timeline and the failures, even friendly media outlets can't pretend it's not happening. Their own audiences were starting to demand answers. And that's an important lesson in accountability. Sometimes it's not just political opponents who hold leaders' feet to the fire. Sometimes it's the sheer weight of the facts. When a scandal reaches a certain magnitude, when whistleblowers come forward, when convictions pile up, even sympathetic journalists have to ask the hard questions. Otherwise, they lose credibility with their own viewers. So Kristen Welke did her job. She asked the governor directly, "Do you take responsibility?" And as we've seen, his answers didn't exactly inspire confidence. Instead of a clear, "Yes, this happened on my watch and here's what we've done to fix it," viewers got deflection, spin, and a defensive pivot to accusing critics of demonizing communities. And then, just when you thought the interview couldn't get any stranger, Walz made a move that left a lot of people scratching their heads. He started talking about Donald Trump's health. Now, you might be wondering, what does Trump have to do with fraud in Minnesota's social services? The short answer is not much, but in the middle of defending his own record, Walz suddenly shifted gears and suggested that Trump is fading physically and showing signs of mental decline. He pointed to a Thanksgiving message Trump posted online, calling it erratic and concerning, and implied that the former president might not be fit for office. Let's just take a step back for a second. Imagine you're in a job interview and the interviewer asks you about a mistake you made at your last job. Instead of addressing it, you start talking about how your previous boss seems to be getting old and confused. How do you think that would go over? Probably not well, because it looks like you're trying to change the subject, and that's exactly how this looked to a lot of viewers. The timing was especially awkward because on the very same day Walz was questioning Trump's mental fitness, Trump was on camera giving interviews, speaking clearly, and laying out detailed policy positions. Whether you agree with those positions or not, he certainly didn't look like someone in cognitive decline. So Walz's comments came across less like a legitimate concern and more like a political cheap shot, one that backfired by making him look petty and desperate. And Trump didn't let it slide. When asked about Walz's comments, his response was blunt and direct. A reporter on Air Force One brought it up, mentioning that Walz had called him a certain word. Let's just say it's a term that many Americans do find offensive. A word that used to describe someone as mentally deficient. The reporter asked if he stood by calling Walz that Trump's answer, "Yeah, I think there's something wrong with him." Absolutely. Sure. Now, you can debate whether that kind of language is appropriate for public discourse. Many people were taught that name-calling has no place in serious political conversation, and that's a fair point. But here's what happened in the media cycle. Instead of the story staying focused on Walz's defensive interview performance and the underlying fraud, it became about this personal back and forth between two politicians. And in that exchange, Trump came across as confident and unapologetic, while Walz looked like someone who tried to throw a punch and missed. Trump went further, though, and this is where he brought the conversation back to the core issue. He said, anybody that would do what he did, anybody that would allow those people into a state and pay billions of dollars out to Somalia, we give billions of dollars to Somalia. It's not even a country because it doesn't function like a country. It's got a name, but it doesn't function like a country. Whether you agree with Trump's characterization of Somalia or not, he was making a specific point. Why are American taxpayer dollars flowing overseas to places with virtually no functioning government, while programs meant to help Americans are being gutted by fraud? That's a question that resonates with a lot of people, particularly seniors, who remember a time when foreign aid was debated seriously and domestic needs came first. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about one botched interview anymore. It was a national conversation about oversight, about priorities, about what happens when leaders lose control of the systems they're supposed to manage. Cable news picked it up. Social media exploded. And most importantly, people inside Minnesota started speaking out in ways that couldn't be ignored. Remember those Department of Human Services employees we talked about earlier? The ones who said they'd been retaliated against for reporting fraud? Their story started getting traction. One of their posts on social media received close to 20 million views. 20 million. That's not a fringe conspiracy theory. That's a message resonating with a massive audience because it confirms what a lot of people suspected. Something was deeply wrong, and the people trying to fix it were being silenced. These weren't anonymous trolls or political operatives. These were people who identified themselves as current state employees, folks still working in the system, who felt so strongly about what they'd witnessed that they were willing to speak out despite the risks. Think about the courage that takes. In most jobs, if you publicly criticize your boss, you can expect to face consequences. But they did it anyway because they felt the public had a right to know. Their account described a pattern of behavior that, frankly, should alarm anyone who cares about honest government. They said that when fraud was reported instead of investigating, leadership responded by questioning the motives of the people reporting it. Instead of auditing the programs, they audited the whistleblowers. Instead of transparency, there was intimidation. And instead of correcting the problems, there was a culture of looking the other way, especially if raising the issue might be politically uncomfortable. One particularly damning detail, they said that concerns were often dismissed because officials didn't want to appear to be targeting specific communities. In other words, there was a fear that cracking down on fraud might be perceived as discrimination. And so in an effort to avoid that perception, actual crimes were allowed to continue. Think about the twisted logic there. Real victims, taxpayers, program beneficiaries who genuinely needed help. Honest members of every community were all harmed because leaders were more worried about optics than about doing the right thing. For seniors, this might remind you of something you've seen throughout your lives. The difference between leaders who act based on principle and leaders who act based on polls. The ones who do what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular, tend to be remembered well by history. The ones who constantly calculate political advantage, who try to please everyone and end up pleasing no one, those are the ones who leave messes behind. And Minnesota is dealing with a mess, because the fraud wasn't just about money disappearing, it had real consequences for real people. Programs that were supposed to feed children had to cut back because funds were gone. Services for people with disabilities were strained because resources had been devoted. Housing assistance programs, already stretched thin, had even less to work with. Every dollar stolen was a dollar that didn't go to someone who actually needed it. There's also a human cost that doesn't show up on spreadsheets. When people see that a system can be gamed this easily, it breeds cynicism. Honest people start to wonder, why am I playing by the rules when others aren't? Trust in institutions erodes. And once that trust is gone, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. You can't just pass a new law or hire a new administrator and expect people to suddenly believe again. Trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. And Minnesota has lost a lot of it. So how are Motans reacting? Well, the response has been pretty intense. Social media posts from residents show a mix of anger, betrayal, and frustration. People are asking why their governor spent more time on TV attacking Trump than explaining what happened in his own state. They're asking why, if he knew about the fraud and people were being prosecuted, the systems weren't fixed earlier. They're asking why whistleblowers had to go public because internal channels didn't work. And there's a growing sense, even among people who voted for Walz, that he's not taking this seriously enough. When a leader's first instinct is to defend, deflect, and attack critics, rather than to acknowledge a problem and lay out a plan to fix it, people notice. They might not be political scientists, but they know accountability when they see it, and they know evasion when they see it too. There's also talk about the next election cycle. Some political observers are asking whether this scandal will hurt Walz if he runs for re-election or if he has aspirations for higher office. The answer probably depends on what he does next. If he takes ownership, if he implements real reforms, if he makes it clear that this will never happen again on his watch, voters might give him credit for learning from a mistake. But if he continues to downplay it, to blame others, to treat it as a political attack rather than a legitimate crisis, well, voters have long memories, especially when it comes to their wallets. And let's be honest, this isn't really a partisan issue, even though it's being covered that way in some outlets. Fraud is fraud. Stealing from taxpayers is wrong, whether it's done by people on the left, the right, or anywhere in between. Most Americans, regardless of political affiliation, believe in a simple principle. If you take money that isn't yours, there should be consequences. And if leaders fail to prevent or stop that theft, they should be held accountable. Which brings us to the bigger question, the one that matters not just for Minnesota, but for the whole country. What does the situation teach us about leadership, responsibility, and how government should work? First, it reminds us that accountability isn't optional. When something goes wrong, especially something this big, the person in charge has to own it. Not spin it, not deflect it, not blame the media or political opponents. Own it. Say clearly, this happened under my watch. Here's what went wrong. Here's what I'm doing to fix it. Here's how we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what leaders do. And when they don't, people lose faith not just in that individual leader, but in the whole system. Second, whistleblowers matter. These are the people who see problems early before they become catastrophic. And if we want good government, we have to protect whistleblowers, not punish them. That means creating systems where people can report concerns without fear of retaliation. It means taking those concerns seriously and investigating them promptly. And it means thanking the people who have the courage to speak up because they're doing a service to all of us. Third, oversight and auditing aren't bureaucratic annoyances. They're essential safeguards. The Office of the Legislative Auditor, Inspectors General, independent watchdogs. These aren't obstacles to good governance. They're tools for achieving it. When leaders weaken or ignore these institutions, it's usually because they don't want scrutiny. And that should be a red flag for every voter. Transparency and accountability go hand in hand. If someone's afraid of auditors, you have to ask, what are they hiding? Fourth, good intentions aren't enough. Minnesota's programs were created with noble goals: feed hungry kids, support people with disabilities, help families find housing. But good intentions without strong controls are an invitation to fraud. It's not cynical to say that. It's realistic. Most people are honest, but some aren't. And systems have to account for that. Checks and balances, verification processes, audits, these aren't signs of distrust. They're signs of responsibility. And finally, leadership means making hard choices. Sometimes doing the right thing is politically uncomfortable. Sometimes it means risking criticism. Sometimes it means acknowledging that a program you championed has been exploited. But that's the job. If you want the authority and the prestige of leadership, you have to accept the responsibility that comes with it. You don't get to pick and choose which problems you'll own up to based on how they pull. For some of you watching this unfold, there's probably a sense of déjà vu. Many of you have seen scandals before Watergate, Iran-Contra, various state and local corruption cases over the decades. And you've seen how leaders respond. Some rise to the occasion, take responsibility, and come out stronger. Others double down, deny, deflect, and eventually fade from the scene. History tends to be pretty clear about which approach works better in the long run. But here's something worth thinking about. This isn't just ancient history or a civics lesson. What happens in Minnesota or any state affects all of us. When taxpayer money is stolen, it has to be made up somewhere, either through higher taxes, cuts to other programs, or increased debt that future generations will have to pay off. When trust in government erodes, it becomes harder to do anything that requires collective action. When fraud goes unpunished, it encourages more fraud. These aren't abstract problems. They ripple outward and touch everyone's lives. And that's why stories like this matter. Not because they're partisan talking points, not because they give us someone to be angry at, but because they're teachable moments. They show us what good governance looks like and what it doesn't look like. They remind us that the people we elect have real power over our lives, and we have a responsibility to hold them accountable. They prove that sunlight really is the best disinfectant, and that when citizens pay attention and demand answers, change becomes possible. So, where's the story go from here? Well, legally, prosecutions will continue. Federal authorities have already convicted several dozen people involved in these fraud schemes, and more cases are in the pipeline. Some of those convicted are facing serious prison time, 10, 15, even 20 years in some cases. That sends a message that this kind of theft won't be tolerated, even if it took longer than it should have to catch. Politically, Governor Walz will have to decide how he wants to handle this going forward. Does he continue to treat it as a political attack and dig in his heels? Or does he recognize that his initial response was inadequate and shift toward real reform? Time will tell. But one thing's for sure, voters are watching and they'll remember. For the rest of us, the lesson is pretty clear. Pay attention, ask questions. Don't accept spin or deflection as a substitute for answers. Support the people who have the courage to report wrongdoing even when it's uncomfortable. And remember that government works best when citizens stay engaged and hold leaders accountable. Because at the end of the day, this isn't Tim Walz's government or Donald Trump's government or any politician's government. It's ours. We pay for it. We depend on it. And we have every right to demand that it operates with honesty, integrity, and respect for the people it serves. So here's what we've learned today. A massive fraud scheme totaling hundreds of millions, or possibly over $1 billion, exploited Minnesota's social service programs during whistleblowers inside the system raised alarms early, but faced retaliation instead of support. When confronted about it on national television, Governor Walz deflected, blamed critics, and even tried to shift the conversation to Trump's health rather than taking clear responsibility. The story gained national attention, not just because of the dollar amounts, but because it exposed fundamental failures in leadership, accountability, and oversight. And now, Minnesota residents, along with Americans across the country, are left wondering what happens next and what lessons should be learned. This is a story about more than just one state or one politician. It's about the importance of transparency, the courage of whistleblowers, and the absolute necessity of holding leaders accountable when they fail to protect the public trust. It's about remembering that government exists to serve us, not the other way around. And it's about recognizing that when we stay informed, ask tough questions, and refuse to accept excuses, we have the power to demand better. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, please share it with your friends and family, especially those who care about honest government and fiscal responsibility. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Governor Walz handled the situation appropriately? What reforms do you think are needed to prevent this kind of fraud in the future? And most importantly, what does this story teach us about the kind of leadership we should demand from our elected officials? Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, accountability starts with